evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Reference Point. I'm your host, Dave Cokerhook. Back for another continuing discussion here with Mr. John Renesch, who's the author of this fantastic book, The Great Growing Up, Being Responsible for Humanity's Future. John, thank you for being back. Well, actually, you just stuck around because we're just taping these shows back to back. By the way, there's this neat little sticker on your book here. Why don't you let everybody know what that's all about?
Well, we got notice in May that we were identified as the grand prize winner of all nonfiction books by Indie Book Awards, which is an award that goes to books that are published by independent publishers and presses, not chains,
right?
Like the big ones. So anyway, it's the best of all the categories. They have 60 categories of books, and we won one category, which is culture change.
Right.
And then the next day, they sent us another email saying you're now been selected as the grand prize winner. So
well, fantastic! Congratulations. And I will say, I've told you this off camera, but I'll tell everybody now. Having read this book, I mean, it's very good, very cool. For me, it got my blood rolling. It got me interested in saying, look, what you're saying here makes sense. What can I do personally to take some action, to do some things, which is exactly what we want to talk about in this segment of the show. We ended off the last time talking about the fact that we've had all these systems in place impacted by cultures and whatnot. And we give an example of in a business world how you establish something with a particular intent and how it can start to go sideways if you're not really judicious about making sure that it stays on course and that sort of thing. And at the end of the show, I said we wanted to talk more about how you can actually facilitate the sort of positive change and maturation process that you're talking about in this book. So, in the break, there were a couple things that you mentioned, so let's kind of go into that. And you had an example that you wanted to talk about, I think, relative to something I think people will respond to right now, which has to do with what's going on in Washington, D.C. these last few months.
Or what isn't going on.
Or what isn't going on.
No work is getting done. No, I was saying that if we were the board member of a company whose executives were acting like they're acting in Washington, we'd fire them all. No doubt about it. If they were our children, we'd reprimand them.
Right.
We'd take their allowance away or take the car use away or something like that. But there's no repercussions, which is where as a population, we are empowering this adolescent behavior, this dysfunction.
Right.
So in a way, you could say we're getting the government we deserve because we're not doing anything about it.
Well, the original system when it was put in place is not exactly like the system is operating today.
Definitely not.
And I think one of the things we talked about in the last session had to do with if you're not judicious in watching what's going on, your systems can go offline and they become dysfunctional as opposed to functional.
Right.
And so they're not serving you, they're providing a disservice. And it seems that over the decades, that sort of thing has become the net result of what we're seeing in the political system that we have right now. And it's not just in Washington, D.C. We have the same problems in Sacramento here in California.
And throughout the world.
Throughout the world, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think a big culprit, there's lots of culprits contributing to this dysfunction, but one of the biggest ones to me is the corporatocracy that we've become. We're not a democracy anymore. Money is running everything.
True.
And money is running campaigns, money is running the politicians.
Mm-hmm.
What politicians go to Washington for, initially, at least I choose to believe, is to contribute to the people, to contribute to the well-being of the population of the country, right?
Right.
Their second loyalty is perhaps to their party. Their final loyalty is to themselves as career politicians, and that's like get elected, make sure I have campaign, people on my team that donate money and all that. What's happened is that's flipped.
Right.
And the first priority, after they are there a while, is get reelected. Part of the rationale is, well, if I wanted to do the good I think I can do, I have to get reelected.
Right.
And then the second loyalty is to their party, to a fault, I would say, in the last 4 or 5 years.
Or maybe a section of the party.
Or yeah, a section of the party. And then the third loyalty is, oh yeah, by the way, we work for the people. So that's our third priority. But it's down the food chain a bit. But again, if we are allowing this to happen, and that's what I said in the first segment, is that much of the dysfunction and much of the spiral downward that we're going through right now is not due to somebody's action, it's due to many people's inaction.
Right. You know, in that example that you just gave, you were identifying the fact that the money scenario has had a huge impact, and which means, in my mind, to some degree, that business has the larger corporate donors or the wealthy individuals who have made their money through some sort of business activity generally are the ones that are impacting this. So business has, in my mind, a role to play in this whole concept. And as a matter of fact, we were talking about something, you had an analogy, I think you mentioned earlier, the train analogy, that I thought is relevant here, because if it's true that the moneyed interests, which in my mind can largely be equated to the business interests, is leading the charge right now, maybe that's the place where we can have the greatest level of redirection.
Well, first I want to be clear, because I've caught some flack on this, that it isn't just business. There's a lot of lobbying out there being done by everybody, and a lot of people are throwing a lot of money at Washington.
I agree.
I think each senator and representative in Congress has like 16 lobbyists. The ratio is something like 16 to 1. I might be a little wrong on that, but can you imagine what your calendar's like? You know, seeing one lobbyist after another all day long.
A lot of that lobbying activity is tied to an interest that has a business ramifications for an industry group or whatever, but there are also the philosophical groups, that were
right.
But let's talk about the business side and how business can be a leading progressive component to this change that we were talking about in the last segment.
Back in the 80s, early 80s, I met a man named Willis Harmon who became a mentor to me, and he's mentioned quite a bit in the book as well. And Willis started the World Business Academy back in 87 or 88. I was an early member and became managing director for a couple of years. And one of the things that we've said many times in talks around the country is that business is the locomotive pulling the train of society. So basically, society is going to follow how business wants it to go. So if we can influence business a little bit, even 2 or 3 degrees, it can make a huge change in the rest of the train, the direction it's going.
Do you think this has always been true? I mean, historically, you go back and you look at
I think it's industrial age, part of the industrial age piece. I mean, not to say that people with money didn't have a lot of influence, but when we left the monarchy or the royalty or the divine right of kings and got into the Industrial Revolution, I think that was where corporations, the railroads had a huge influence on the laws regarding railroads. I mean, they were one of the first lobbying organizations back in, I think, the late 1800s, something like that. Yeah.
Cool. Well, that leads me to something that's in the book, and I am going to pull out my digital version because I know where it is in the digital version of the book. Because you had, there were some key points you mentioned about the CoRound Table that was, I guess, a group of business and social leaders that met some, tell me, you told me a little bit about this.
Yeah.
I don't remember all the details, but because there are some key principles that it talked about that I think tie to business and economics that are very relevant to what we're talking about. So let's start with telling us what the CoRound Table is all about, and then we'll go into...
Well, first let me explain to your listeners that Co is C-A-U-X, and it's a, I'm not sure it's a city, but it's a community high above Montreux, which is on the shore of Lake Geneva. And Moral Rearmament is an organization that grew out post-World War II, so that we'd never have another Hitler. So that they chose a rather poor term, but that's the term they used, moral rearmament. And they ended up, people in that group ended up forming the CoRound Table. And it was designed to be leaders from industry who were leading fairly large companies who really wanted to see the world not be Hitlerized, not eradicate evil and do good in the world.
Right.
And I was there in 90 as an observer of the Round Table, And there was the Fritz Phillips of Phillips, the Phillips Company was there, chairman of Canon was there, CEO of Citicorp was there,
Wow.
a number of other people, about
Right.
12, 15 people at the table. And after that year, and about a year or two later, they came up with the co-principles about sustainability. They thought they ought to take a stand and come up with this.
And this was back in the 90s, early 90s?
Early 90s, yeah.
Okay, which was really very cool. So I'm going to read some of these.
Which happens to be over 20 years ago now.
20 years ago, yeah. So, all right, I'm going to read these principles, and then I have a question for you. So there were 7 key principles that they came up with. One is the responsibility of businesses beyond shareholders towards stakeholders, which the difference between a shareholder and a stakeholder is something we'll get to in a minute. Second one was the economic and social impact of business toward innovation, justice, and world community, which I think is cool. Business behavior beyond the letter of law toward a spirit of trust, which is a real significant one. Fourth was respect for rules. Fifth was support for multilateral trade. Sixth is respect for the environment. And seventh, avoidance of illicit operations. So the first question that comes to mind to me are these 7 principles. If these were put forth close to 20 years ago, has progress been made in that direction that's discernible?
I didn't know you were going to ask me that question.
I didn't know either until I read them.
I'm sure there has been some progress in some segments somewhere, but I'm not large. I would not enough to where I'd say there's been progress. I'd say to some degree there's been backsliding on it, and what tends to get into the media usually is the bad stuff.
Right.
So we hear more about the backsliding than we do about the good stuff. So I tell my listeners when I'm giving a talk that right now we have, it's the best of times and the worst of times. Right now we have, if you look at what gets the media attention, what gets the buzz going, whatever gets everybody talking about, it's all the threat to the global commons and all the degeneration, social injustice, etc., and lack of community, etc.
Right.
But percolating individually amongst millions and millions of people in the world is this new sense of consciousness, this new rising. But that doesn't get attention.
Right, of course not, because it doesn't sell papers.
There's something really good happening and there's something very bad happening. They're both going on.
And okay, so now I want to go back to a couple of these things. Thank you for that. And the first principle was the responsibilities of business beyond shareholders towards stakeholders, and I wanted to make sure that we, as you know, our audience understands what the distinction between those two things are.
Well, there's been a very well-entrenched philosophy that the only responsibility companies have, publicly held companies, is to return to investors, which are shareholders. And that was advanced by several people, Milton Friedman being the most widely quoted. And to me, it couldn't be further from the truth. So when they say a shift from shareholders to stakeholders, stakeholders include the investors, they include the employees, they include the communities in which they operate, and they include the communities in which they operate or sell goods, and their vendors. So all those people are stakeholders in that organization, not just the stockholders. Right,
and I think that broader perspective is key to longevity and long-term success, and I think we can see very clearly through history companies who have only thought about, you know, how can we leverage things in the bottom line and you know, for the stockholders. They're the ones, Enron, you know, long gone, that sort of thing. Okay.
Yeah, there's a group called Social Venture Network that grew out of the 60s. And they have a number of people that have started companies that are socially responsible. That's their whole mode, is they start socially responsible enterprises. And they've grown considerably over the last few years, the last 20 years. But I think business as usual is pretty much going on in the major corporate boardrooms.
Right.
There's a lot of focus on green, which is good. That's a step in the right direction.
Right. Yeah.
But you can greenwash yourself pretty easily these days,
right,
and make it look like you're green. I see some of the Chevron's ads, and then I know what they're doing down in South America, and it's like, wait a minute, that don't compute.
Yeah. Yeah. The left hand and the right hand thing.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to touch on one more of these things. Then we're going to go on to a little bit about what I as an individual can do. Another one here about business behavior beyond the letter of law toward a spirit of trust, which is, I mean, talk about divergent, the spirit of trust. Let's talk about that and what that means with respect to this
Well,
concept
I think what's happened with the corporate responsibility movement is the more laws we put in place saying you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do that, so corporations started hiring people called compliance officers. And that has built a culture of, if it isn't illegal, if my compliance officer says it's not illegal, it's okay to do.
Right.
So that's going to the letter of the law. In some cases they push that, but it's not the spirit of the community. It's not the spirit of the well-being of the planet and all the people on it.
Takes us back to that first thing about stakeholders. Because if you're really looking at trying to if the objective is to think beyond the shareholders to the stakeholders, then this question of the way that the business operates will generate this sense of trust in its supply chain, in its customers, in the community in which it is located, etc., as opposed to just, well, these guys are and they're a big employer, and I guess we'll just let them do what they do.
Yeah, I'm thinking right now of a guy who unfortunately died of cancer a couple of years ago, named Ray Anderson, and he was the founder and CEO of blank. This is a senior moment. Interface Carpets.
Oh, okay.
And they were the largest maker of modular carpets in the world. They had plants in 23 countries, very petrochemically intense and doing a lot of environmental damage. And he read a book, I believe it was I'll try to remember the book, but it was written by, one of the authors was Paul Hawken. And it changed his life. He read that book and recognized that he was a thief, and he wrote a book saying that. I was a legal thief, but I was stealing from the planet. And he made a commitment to take his company, which had gone public, was publicly held, to take that company to where it had a zero footprint on the planet.
Oh, wow.
In a certain period of time. I'm not sure they're quite there yet, but he unfortunately died last year. But he's got a pretty good gal in his shoes holding that goal and that vision.
That's fantastic.
But that's what one person can do if he happens to be the head of the company.
Which takes us right into the next thing to talk about here, which was how if someone is recognizing the fact that as we mentioned earlier, that these systems, some systems are dysfunctional, what can you do? How do you move forward? And there were some I don't know what you'd call them here.
Suggestions?
Suggestions, right? And one of which is become emotionally mature. And, we had talked about this whole maturation process of growing up, and that emotional and spiritual maturity are things that don't necessarily happen in the way that physical maturity occurs. They have to be more of a conscious thing, something that you take some action in order to facilitate. So, fair statement?
Yes. To me, when I had a pretty tough childhood. I won't get into the details, but I was pretty much emotionally closed down until I was in my late 30s. And thanks to a lot of suggestions from a girlfriend, a lot of therapy, it made sense, so I had a lot of intentionality to do something about it. So I really went after it, and it took 4 or 5 years to get to the place where my heart finally opened up. And I recognized that once I was accessible to all my emotions, I saw the whole world very differently, very differently. There was much more compassion about it. It wasn't more about me, it was about us.
There you go.
And to me, so that personal process for me was incredibly rewarding and worthwhile. I would recommend it to anybody.
And I think that concept of that self-evaluation is critical for anyone. The next one of these things, ruthlessly examine the underlying assumptions in the way you think, which is critical in my mind because so many of us will say, I have this belief, and beliefs by definition are not necessarily true. It's that which you assign truth to. But ruthlessly examining the underlying assumptions in the way you think would open up an opportunity for someone to see things from somebody else's perspective.
And it takes introspection, and that's why the word ruthlessly is in there, because it's not just take a look and think about it for a minute and say, no, I'm okay. Really look at what your belief is, what are all the assumptions underlying that, which ones make you squirm a little bit, because that might be where the pay dirt is, And if you need, get a coach or somebody to help you with that process. There are people that do that. But most assumptions, we were in a process the other day with one of our groups, and a CEO of a large organization mentioned that he was having trouble getting time to exercise. And he recognized after going through this process that the reason that he was having difficulty is that he felt that if he took time off to exercise, he wouldn't be seen as important as the leader of the organization.
Interesting.
That he had to work a lot harder, and therefore he didn't have time for exercise. That's just a little example.
Wow. Yeah. Next one, engage others in dialogue, which, I mean, when you look at let's go back to our example that we talked about earlier of a system that's having some issues, which was in Congress. The idea is you've got people of different perspectives to engage in dialogue to come up with a solution that everybody can live with. There isn't dialogue going on in a lot of sections of society these days.
For 8 years, I ran a thing called the Presidio Dialogues in San Francisco. And it was a publicly held meeting once a month. We'd have some conversation starters that would get us started on a theme, a couple of people, and then we'd open it to dialogue. And we are so used to discussion, and we are so used to making a point so that we can look good, that I'd give myself a B- in terms of reaching dialogue in a public forum after 8 years. It's the familiar. We're back to the familiar. I'm familiar, and we learn this in school, especially in graduate school if you're an MBA. We learn how to make our point and act smart, or look smart to everybody, and make great questions and give great answers. And we carry that into our daily discussions all the time.
Right.
And dialogue comes from a spirit of inquiry.
Yes.
Like, I don't know the answer. I'm looking for it, and we may end up starting a circle of 10 people on a certain subject, spend 2 hours together, and we may answer some of those questions, but we may have more questions than we entered the conversation with. It's much more engaging, it's much more human, and there's less hierarchicalness in it, and it's quite frankly, I find it incredibly rewarding.
Very cool.
There's discovery. There's discovery going on. Yeah.
Dialogue can lead to discovery, exactly. We may not be able to get to every one of these, but some of these stand out to me. Here's another one. Learn how to think more systemically. We talked about systems failing right now, but systemic thinking is, from what you've said and what I've read in the book, is critical to being able to understand how to either create a new system or fix a broken system.
Right.
So talk about systemic thinking a little bit.
Systems thinking is a relatively new discipline. It's 1940s, late 40s. And what we've done is we are still thinking linearly about everything. And we've created these Frankenstein monsters. We've created these systems that have gotten incredibly complex. The system is no longer you, me, and the work we're doing. That's too much of a simple system. But where there's hundreds of people or thousands of people or millions of people all doing things a little different way, and the system has gotten so complex that it's kind of outfoxed us all. It's bigger and stronger and more powerful than we are individually. So the way of starting to think about learning about systems and how they operate, you start seeing that the old way, the linear approach to seeing a systems problem is somebody must not be doing their job. There's got to be somebody to blame in here. So they go after somebody and they scapegoat somebody and they fire them, and then guess what? The problem still goes on. So if you start learning how to think systemically, you might say, these are already good-hearted people here. They're well-intended, they're skilled, and every time we try to make the problem go away, it gets worse. Maybe there's a systems problem. Maybe it's not a person problem. And I discovered systems thinking in 1981. So whatever that is, a long time. And I still consider myself a scholar of systems. I don't consider myself an expert at all. But I'm a perpetual scholar of systems because they are really tricky, and they can fool you a lot because they are basically more complex than we're able to think.
So the point I take away from that is that if, as an individual, you're going to be looking to try to have a positive impact, it is very useful, if not highly encouraged, to go out and become more familiar with this concept. So this is a discipline. right?
It's a discipline, absolutely.
And so one can go up and Google what would you call it?
Systems thinking. There's another field aside from that it's called systems dynamics.
Systems dynamics or systems thinking, and then you could find literature to go read or places you could come and to learn.
Read books, go to lectures, watch YouTube videos, etc. But become more facile in the discipline. And so you start, a little example. I went into an intersection today driving down here, and it was pretty jammed up with cars, and there was a pedestrian just stepped off the crosswalk right in front of the car in front of me. So all the cars had to stop. So one guy, and he knew he had the right of way.
Yeah.
A systems thinker might have said, go ahead, because he was stopping all this traffic and just waited like 5 seconds and walked across the street.
Right.
So that was not a systemic thinker doing that action.
Got it. One of the other ones I want to bring up here is end your addictions, which I think is a very interesting one. And when we talked about this, we're not necessarily talking about substance addictions, are we?
No. And it's as I hear that, it sounds so simple, end your addictions. Oh, sure, I'll just end my addictions. It's not quite that easy. But one is recognizing what things you're addicted to. You could be addicted to gossip. You could be addicted to television. You could be addicted to a certain way of thinking. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of things. You could
be addicted to the lifestyle. You could be addicted to, whatever.
Addicted to having income. A car.
Yeah.
Yeah. Get addicted to looking good.
Right.
That sort of thing. So there's lots of 12-step programs and other kinds of programs that help people on breaking addictions, but it's work. It's, again, more work on themselves, but I happen to go to a 12-step meeting. I don't have a problem with that particular program, but I found that it's just incredibly, it's like more spiritual in church for me. I've been doing 9.5 years to this 12-step program, and it's like, why don't more people go to 12-step programs? Just as a way of living, just as a formula for living life.
Right.
Not breaking an addiction.
So, John, we have just reached the point where we have less than a minute left in reference point. But I think what we've covered here in this session and talking about some of the points that we've identified, I think is critical. I'm going to ask you to take 15 seconds and sum things up. That's 5 of them.
I wasn't expecting that. Grow up.
Grow up. Yeah, and that's pretty much it. Okay, and it can be done, and you can take a proactive motion to make that happen.
You have to take a proactive motion.
John's book is, they put up the website, etc. So it's a fantastic book. John, thank you for being here. This has been fantastic, and I hope the audience has gotten something out of it too, as much as I have.
Great to be here.
So, ladies and gentlemen, see you next time on Reference Point. Thank you.